good afternoon, good morning, whatever time of the day it is. Thank you for joining us all today. I'm Brian Falchuk. I'm your host for this webinar from Reuters Events Insurance, and we are talking about fraud today. And fraud is an interesting one because it's a huge problem. That's not news, and it's something we can't just not do anything about. We have to take action on it. We can't let the bad apples get in and ruin the risk pot and the pricing and the losses and all that. Yet at the same time, we're under much more pressure than we ever have been in delivering efficient, smooth claims processes for our insureds and our claimants. And balancing those two are somewhat at odds, or might be. And the question is, how do we move forward on the efficiency side and the customer experience side, yet also ensure we're doing the right thing when it comes to fraud? What tools can we use, processes, new ways of thinking to move forward on both at the same time? Can they be symbiotic? That's the discussion we are set to have today, and I'm very excited to be joined by the panel that we have. It's a mix of people from the carrier and the provider side. We have Eric Saunders, who joins us as the head of claims for North America for QBE. We have Dan Donovan, who is the head of customer success for Shift Technology, and Daniel Peregrina, who's VP of claims for Chubb. As I said, I'm Brian Falchuk. I'm the host today. I'm the managing partner of Insurance Evolution Partners and the author of the book series, The Future of Insurance: From Disruption to Evolution. I'm excited you've joined us, and what I want to ask of all of you attending is to make sure you ask questions. There's a little Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Make sure you use it, and you don't have to wait until the Q&A portion of this discussion at the end. You can ask your questions at any time. We'll get them teed up, and I want to make sure we get to as many of those audience questions as possible. Now, we're going to give you some content to spark those questions. So with that, I want to hand it to Eric, who's going to start off the conversation and share some thoughts with us, your perspective at QBE on this kind of tension we have between handling the fraud and making sure we're efficient and giving the right customer experience.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. I'm really happy to be here today and speak with everybody. So yeah, I was listening to that, Brian, and we look at everything in that same context. It's not just fraud. We look at it as the triangle. There's efficiency, there's effectiveness, there's customer considerations for everything we do. And it's certainly an understatement to say this is a big problem for all of us. We all have a responsibility in what we do about it. I know I was reviewing some statistics kind of leading up to this, and the numbers are just staggering across the board. And so, we're all out there fighting the good fight, and the bad actors have become really sophisticated. And I know I've watched it over the last many years, and especially in the last year with the pandemic. And it is really, it has been really interesting and challenging to see how folks are adapting on the other side of this. And that creates a lot of tension for us because we've got a lot of work to do. And yet, we've got limited resources to do it with. And then on top of that, another thing that we've been tracking is that consumer attitudes are changing. I saw a statistic that said 84% of the respondents said submitting an inflated claim is unethical, right? Or is ethical, actually. Sorry, is unethical. So that means 16 out of 100 people are saying that it's ethical to submit an inflated claim. And that's just the people answering the question that way, right? So that's a pretty significant concern from our perspective. You couple that with things like the social inflation trend, where we're seeing, a lot of anti-corporate sentiment just that is just around. And that just makes our job challenging. So we have all these things sort of spinning around. So how does that work for us? So what do we do? So I thought I would start by sharing some insights on how we're tackling the problem. And for us, it always starts, the way to identify bad actors starts with good plans. And good plans always start with, how you are assessing your organization. So I kind of thought I'd take the group through here, what we've done relative to a detailed, deep dive assessment, because without that, you're going to really struggle, I think, to kind of figure out how you solve for a problem if you don't know exactly what you're solving for. On our end, we started with the business plan. It's really important that we on our side understand the business plan in detail. And that means certainly what line of businesses you're writing, what industries you're in, but then you got to get down to the specific exposures. You've got to get down to what is the appetite? What's the mix of business? And I would say we found it really helpful to develop strong relationships with our business partners, because the plans kind of go beyond the four corners of a business plan. When you speak with the business partners, you're accomplishing two things, I think. One is you're certainly understanding the depth and breadth of the business plan as it relates to your organization. Two, you're building sort of a coalition internally around how you address the problem. And we all need support in our organizations, right? We need financial support. We need folks communicating around the importance of the issue and so forth. So that was one thing we looked at. We looked at, which client, how are we managing the claims themselves? At QBE, we have a really diverse book of business. So we've got both directly handled claims and TPA managed claims that we oversee. How do you deal with that? Those are two very different problems. We did an assessment of how we were communicating. And again, it's not just about building a coalition, how you're communicating to senior leadership, but it's also about how you're communicating to your team and what they're understanding their role is. And, obviously training and things like that too. But how we're communicating was a big part of our assessment and understanding that in detail. Performance, how transparent were we? When I came into the organization, I'm not sure we were all really on the same page relative to how we were performing. So it was important for us to do an assessment of how we were performing, and being really honest with ourselves as an organization. There's, data is always an issue, right? And you need to look at how good your data is. And I think we can probably all say we've got some shortcomings in that space. Well, how does that play out? It plays out in terms of reporting. How does it play out in terms of decision-making? Things like that. So we went through an exercise of kind of looking at what we measure, looking what data we collect, outside of fraud, just broadly, but then prioritizing what we care about. And the typical example I use is, volume of referrals, for example. That's a good thing, right? You want to certainly have a number of referrals going through, but just how impactful is that really? And so, there's a lot of different levels that you can get to relative to how you're thinking about your performance. And I think once you've done a detailed assessment to understand where you sit organizationally, then you can kind of build a bridge to, okay, well, let's measure X, Y, and Z and sort of really highlight those and be transparent organizationally about where we sit. So that's just a way of saying, look, there's a lot of segmentation that happens. As I mentioned earlier, we have limited resources. Great example at QBE. We've got a really big crop business, really important business for us. And I would never sit here and tell you that the crop doesn't have fraud, right? But if I look at crop, which has a lot of, sort of government regulation and a very specific sort of product, versus auto, comp, or some of the other lines, where are you going to ultimately invest your dollars and how are you going to do that? That sort of gets to the tension, I think, that Brian was talking about. So once we've kind of gone through, figuring out the footprint, right? The next step would be, okay, so you understand where you sit. How are you going to get into the detail of what fraud might be being sort of, perpetrated against your organization? And I think our experience has been that, you want fraud scenarios. We all probably talk about fraud scenarios, but how detailed are you going and how disciplined are you being about developing your fraud scenarios? So I know in our case, we felt like, one, we needed to write them down. Two, we needed to get really specific. And as we've all seen over the last year, they evolve. So we also instilled some discipline around how frequently we're updating these very detailed fraud scenarios so that then we can react, right? So before we're solving, we're doing the deep dive on where we sit today. We're kind of figuring out what fraud scenarios are out there that are really relevant for us. We're mapping that against, okay, how big of a problem is it? If it's a business we're exiting, it's important, but maybe not as important as a business we're growing in, for example. And I would say the same thing kind of goes for red flags. So like there's a lot of generic red flags out there. That's great. Those are very helpful. But ultimately, I think what we found is we got to go to the next level. There's a lot more depth that you can get to in each of the scenarios as you're building them out. And I think that that's, all of that can be pretty traditional, and we're all probably doing some form of that. But that's where some of the tools, and I know some of the other panelists will get deep into, some of the other kind of technology offerings that are out there, and I'll share a little bit about what we're doing as well. But things like analytics on top of that, or taking those, sort of more disciplined, detailed scenarios and kind of carrying them to the next level, so that now you've got analytics on top of it, and you've got all these tools that are helping you understand it with depth, and you're kind of constantly re-upping on what they are, and that leads to kind of further solutions. So maybe I'll turn quickly to process, just around, look, we've kind of done a detailed organizational assessment. We've kind of looked at what we've got. And then I think the next question kind of comes to, all right, so what are you doing to kind of manage these millions of insureds? How are you making the decisions that were referenced up top, and the difference between efficiency and effectiveness? And I think there's a whole lot around that. And it all starts, with kind of understanding where you're starting from. And then the next step becomes, okay, so where do you take that? So for example, we're making a pretty big investment at QBE in straight through processing. That's really important for our book of business, that aligns with our business plans. That's where we're heading. And we've made really great progress. So straight through processing, is something that you cannot effectively do unless you've got, a really good defense against fraud built in an automated fashion. That leads to, the things that a lot of us are using out there, like scoring models and algorithms, right? And kind of layering in data and analytics on top of that, so that we've got real-time assessments of how, effective we're being in that space. And then, layering in tools as we go, building it out so that you've got the ability to scale it. So metadata, right, is another one that a lot of us are using now. How do you kind of build that into the process so that you can effectively automate it? And that way, you have a high confidence level when you're straight through processing. But on the other side for us is we've got a lot of MGA business with TPAs. So we've got challenges with data there, and we've got challenges with how do we influence outcomes there. And one of the things that we've learned is, when you're placing business with a third party, you kind of need to understand the fit. They're probably coming to the table with their own set of tools. And so how are those tools lining up with that detailed assessment that I talked about on the front end? And is that something that is a good fit? And I don't know that my entire career, if I've done the best job of kind of thinking about it holistically and kind of bringing together the real need underneath when you're kind of really digging in against what the solutions that are out there in the market, because there's great solutions out there in the market, and it's almost just more about which ones do you select and how do you even go about doing that. So another kind of point that I would make here is just around operating models. That was something I know we looked at when I arrived at QBE. We were an end-to-end shop. Once we kind of sat down and looked at that, did that make sense for us? Was that really sort of the best approach? Obviously you kind of have your end-to-end A to Z shops that do pretty much everything. You've got a hybrid solution out there that would be more of, you've got a third party partner that's kind of doing on the groundwork. You're managing it with oversight on your side, and then you've got completely vended. And so, which of those makes sense for you? And again, for us, it came back to do the detailed assessment, make sure that you really kind of understand exactly where you're starting, what you're trying to solve for with specificity. And that, I think, leads to the next sort of the next step. So maybe I'll land here on just some commentary against some of the tools and the tech that are out there, and kind of how we're thinking about tools and tech when you insert them into that equation. That they fall really for us into three categories. One is kind of tools that gather and move information. They put it in the right spot so it can be used. Two would be tools that actually detect the fraud, right? And three are tools that assist in the workflow and managing the efficiency of the process. And so for the gathering and moving type, I know we're exploring and using bots all over our organization. And they're taking a lot of those menial tasks and sort of taking them off the desk of the claim professional so that they can focus on the thing that we really all need, which is technical expertise applied against, fighting fraud. And I think that we found great success in that. And I think that specifically in the fraud space and specifically related to STP, really going to be important. And then some of the other examples of things we're using just to share, we've got artificial intelligence, machine learning tools on doctor selection, for example, based on outcome. For us, we didn't put that in necessarily specific to fraud, but it's very relevant for fraud because that allows us to kind of get the claims to the right spot. That's a really important one. We mentioned the metadata. We mentioned the data and analytics that we're using all over the place so that we're real-time updating how we feel like we're performing from an efficiency and an effectiveness standpoint. So I know I've probably got a wrap here. Maybe I'll just give a few quick, how is this all coming out for us? What are the key learnings? The deep dive assessment on the current state's critical. I kind of think of it like buying a suit. You go out and you're going to buy yourself a new suit, right? You can grab something off the shelf. It's probably going to look pretty good. It's probably going to get the job done, but the minute you kind of deploy experts in the equation, bring in your tailor and get it fitted for purpose, right? Suddenly you really are kind of able to do a lot more. So I'll kind of leave it there, Brian, and maybe also just comment on, look, reporting is important. Dashboards are important. Measuring the right things, all really important. But in the end, it really comes down to your claim professionals and how tuned in they are to specifically what it is that you're fighting against, how well trained they are, and then kind of layering the tools on top. So
that's great. Thank you, Eric. I will say one of your opening points on the business plan and starting with that, and really good friend, so many of the things you said from there come back to this notion of understanding the business, the priorities, where it falls in the pecking order, where to invest. So that was really relevant. And then you brought up STP. Our first question was about that. STP, touchless, another term that's thrown around a lot. So we will get to those questions, which is a subtle reminder for everyone to put the questions in the Q&A, as I know that you have some brewing. And I saw some questions in the chat about the audio quality. If you're having trouble with it, don't worry, you will get a recording of this afterwards. So if the audio is not working on your end, of course, you can still catch all the great content, and that'll be sent around to everyone who's registered. So with that, let me hand it to Dan Donovan. Dan, I'd love your perspective from Shift, who's not just living in the fraud piece of the puzzle, which is obviously one of the key things we're talking about, but that other side of the equation, the push and pull and the efficiency side, the touchless, the STP, some of the things Eric was talking about, that's another one of your core strengths in your solutions. So you guys are, this tension is exactly what you're addressing. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the subject.
Yep. Thank you. That's great. And Eric, thanks for your insights. You really kind of teed it up for me, actually. So you hit on a lot of the important things. And this is what's interesting from my perspective. Being at a provider sitting in the middle of the industry, we get to hear from a lot of different insurance companies and what their problems are and the tensions they're facing. And it's very, very similar to all the points you raised. And I think the biggest one we're seeing today coming out of the pandemic, and just as insurers want to move more towards digital claim handling, digital processing, more automation, is how do we treat fraud relative to that, right? Because we know that if we make it easy, if we remove human touch, if we're not as close to the customer, if we don't have as good a feel for the individual and the claim, there's risk there, right? And so that's a really big challenge, I think, and it's one of the, if nothing else, mental hurdles that carriers have to get over, right, to start to make this move. And we see that most of them are proceeding pretty cautiously with it, and they do it by looking at certain segments of their business that they think make sense to potentially automate, right? And so that's where we feel, very strongly from a vendor's perspective, that you do have to have a very solid automated fraud detection capability that underpins your claims automation processes, whether it be a full digital end-to-end where you're allowing people to submit their claims online or through apps and trying to take that claim from end to end without any human intervention, or whether it be more of a hybrid type approach or what we like to refer to as an augmented adjusting approach, where you're automating certain aspects of the claim handling process. But there's still other touch points where they may deal with a claim handler, right? And so having good solid fraud detection from FNOL straight through to the end of that claim process is a key capability that you have to think about and have in place, I think, to have a truly effective automated claim handling process. So that's a big area of focus for us for sure, and I know others in the space as well, because you don't want to impact that customer experience either, and that's another key piece of it, right? You don't want to be stopping the process at inappropriate times or inopportune times as well. So it really has to be a technology that can sit on top of your claim solution. This gets us to kind of the discussion around software as a service, which is being more of a, it's opening up in the insurance space. I can tell you, even just 3 years ago, there was a lot of resistance to carriers letting their data outside their own four walls, right? And leveraging software as a service. But this gets to something, Eric, that you raised around kind of things like update frequency, right? And the managing of these models and solutions. Like, what's the opportunity cost if you're trying to do this all yourself in-house? And it certainly can be pretty steep because you've got a lot of other competing projects and priorities within your organizations around, whether it be claims automation, pricing, it could be any type of things, right, that you're working on. And do you have the bandwidth, do your teams have the bandwidth to manage, the ongoing improvements to these models that are required for them to be effective? So, these are other areas that we're getting a lot of interest in and having a lot of discussions with insurers about, is how does the software as a service work? Is it complementary? Is it easier for us? How do you overlay onto our claim system, our policy admin system without, interfering with that, right? And it's an easier process, I think, in a lot of ways. We've even found that through clients sharing their data with us in order to execute on a fraud detection project, as an example, they're finding that they come out of it with a better version of their data than they had going in, because they're pulling it from all these siloed data sources into one data environment. And that data is cleansed, that data is mapped, right? It becomes a cleaner version of data that they can use for other projects as well afterwards. So these are all things that I think it's worth carriers being mindful about when you're starting to think about, is it something we do in-house? Do we use a vendor? Do we take a hybrid approach? And that's another thing you called out, Eric, that I think is interesting. And, carriers should be thoughtful about as they talk to vendors when they're thinking about whether it's a claims automation project or a fraud detection type project. How collaborative are these vendors too, right? I've heard it plenty of times before. We've built our own models. We think they work pretty good, but we know we have gaps and there's other things we want to address. And we're really only focused on a specific area of our business. We want to extend that to other lines of business and other coverages. It's important that carriers understand that if you're working with the right vendor, none of that's wasted work that you did before. Your work can be incorporated into the appropriate solutions, right? They should be accommodating to that. And not only that, but the vendor should be willing to work directly with your data scientists. There's a lot to be gained from sharing back and forth, right? Obviously, there's always IP issues on both sides, relative to the vendor's tech or the work that the customer may be doing that they feel gives them a competitive advantage. But those are all things that can be worked through. And I think those are important discussions to have as you look at what kind of technology may you want to leverage outside your organization. How willing are they to partner with you, truly partner with you, to make sure that you're getting the best version of whatever solution you're buying, fraud detection, claims automation, or a combination of the two. So that, that level of ability to incorporate that and then customize through collaboration as well. So again, you talked, Eric, about, you need to really identify what your specific problems are. And that's a key thing. Any product you're looking at, any software solution you're looking at should be highly customizable so that you can address it and tune it to your specific business needs. You don't want a black box off the shelf solution. You need something that's going to really, really be allowed to be fit to your specific need. and can address all your specific areas, whether it be starting at point of sale and point of quote from an underwriting standpoint and carrying on into the claims organization. As I mentioned before, from a claims automation standpoint, whether it's full end-to-end digital capabilities, or can this technology come in and be fit to purpose to help us address very specific use cases within our organization. A great example I think I can give there is we've got a lot of our customers who use very large claim system providers who do a lot of amazing things already with that technology, have great workflow capabilities and other things that help effectively manage claims. But there's certain capabilities they may not bring, like document analysis as an example, right? Where you could really reduce the amount of hours required by claim handlers if you could automate the review of documents, extract appropriate data, verify and validate that data, apply it at scale in a logical way to help inform your thought process and next actions on a claim, right? And all while validating that that data is in fact true, accurate, and free of fraud, right? So, these are things that technology can help you do, and that frees up your claim handlers in a significant way, even though it's not an end-to-end claim processing piece. And I think we lose sight of that in the market, in that we think automation has to be this complete end-to-end reality, and that's not the case. We see it as something that can help you in a number of ways, especially when we look at the aging out of claim handlers in the business today, right? Where we know a lot of very experienced people that hold a high degree of institutional knowledge in these claims organizations are retiring and aging out of the workforce, and it's tough to recruit new people to come in. And so, how can you replicate some of this knowledge that you might be losing? AI, machine learning, and those type of data science-based approaches can really help you backfill that. And while you're doing that, it then creates an environment where you can free up your claim handlers to spend their time on more high-value tasks and more high-value claims and high exposure claims, because they're not stuck in the process of having to do all this administrative work that they have to focus on today just to simply execute on a basic claim. So a lot to this. I know I'm kind of jumping around, but you covered so much, Eric, on the very, the specifics about kind of attacking this stuff, trying to think of it in terms of, or come at this from in terms of, things for carriers to focus on as they look at how they're going to build out these processes and how they might want to apply technology from outside their organization.
Some great points that you added, Dan. I think there's another piece to making the work, raising the work up a level using some of the tools when you talk about solving for the aging out of the workforce and trying to make up some of that gap and make the folks you have more productive. In turn, you're making the work more interesting and attractive, which means now you can recruit for it much more easily than someone coming from another industry or someone who's younger, earlier in their career, looking at this process and say, I don't want to do that. This claim file is 130 documents. They're not really, you go into the documents tab or the history tab, and it's just a sea of stuff. And how do you sort that out? What if all that stuff was actually, insight and was already brought into the process along the way? That's an interesting job to recruit someone into. And then they get to use their brain instead of just sort of this overwhelm of like, I can't even make sense of all this, which is unfortunately what a lot of the expertise has gone to sorting through over the years. And we're lucky to have that, but we can't replace it the way that we have in the past. So yeah.
And it's not the most efficient use of it's not the most efficient use of a claim handler's time, right? So if you can use technology to extract that information and make it actionable in a way that makes it a lot easier for them to quickly make decisions, right? You talked about efficiency, Eric, and effectiveness, right? That's a key there, that you can really provide these much deeper insights at a faster pace, right? That allows us to make better, faster decisions for customers, move claims to conclusion faster, and provide a better customer experience. That's a huge key. And the last point I just wanted to make, it's back to something you talked about, Eric, is that you were talking about different pieces of technology that you use, like chatbots to bring the data, and then detection, and then workflow. The other thing I'd mention is you can save yourself a lot of time and a lot of steps if you can find vendors or providers that can bring all of that to you in one package, right? So I think, I'd highly encourage carriers to think in terms of trying to do as much one-stop shopping as you can with integrated solutions that provide all of those things so that you're not having to kind of bolt things together in a Frankenstein monster type of way, right? To create all those capabilities and bring it together. I think you'll find that it's a much more seamless process that works better end to end than if you use multiple different tools. And that doesn't mean there aren't a lot of good tools out there that do very specific things. But when you're really thinking in terms of trying to build out a claims automation platform for your organization that has fraud detection underlying it, if you can find vendors that can do all of those things for you, from data management through detection, through helping to improve your workflow and process and automation of tasks, that's probably your best bet.
Yeah. I was about to hand it to Daniel Peregrina, but it looks like his connection dropped out. So I'm going to move to one of the questions in the Q&A in hopes that Daniel comes back before we get through this one. So hopefully he can rejoin us and share some thoughts from his perspective at Chubb. But Donovan, thank you for that. Let me go to the Q&A, and by all means, I'd love to see more from the attendees. So please do put your questions into the Q&A box. I think we have some going in the chat as well, so make sure you put them in Q&A. So this one is from Africa, so a bit of a global perspective. What would you say is the solution to inflated fraudulent claims? So Eric, this goes back to your 84% of people who are thinking, it's okay, I'll add some dollars to it because I've been paying all that premium, why not? Or, the insurance company has lots of money, why not? So what is the solution to the inflated or fraudulent claims, especially in medical lines or medical exposed claims, motor insurance? It talked about the issue in Africa of ambulance chasers. I can assure you that is not just an African problem. We have that in the States as well, for sure. Tough question, because what is the solution? Is there an actual single solution? If there was, I think the industry would have said, well, there's no fraud problem decades ago. It's something we all live with constantly, and it's maybe not a solution, but it's an improvement, or it's getting better at it. Eric, you've been in different lines. What are your thoughts on how you control for some of that claims inflation?
Yeah. I don't think it's an easy problem, and we would have all solved it by now had it been an easy problem to solve. And I think it just comes back to, starting with the fundamentals. So here, in the US, certainly having access to claim history, and I don't know how that would work there in Africa, but having access to claim history so that you see those patterns would be certainly something that would be relevant to kind of, once you identify it, then you can take the next steps of, generally speaking, it's not just, ambulance chasers out there kind of grabbing whoever they can grab. It then goes to the next step, which is, okay, well, then you're kind of sending them to this doctor, and that right there's a whole chain that typically happens. So I think the identification, which for me is, if you have access to claim histories and what's transpired previously across all the facets, not just for the claimant, but for anyone else who might be involved with that claim, would be an important part of it. And then I just say, look, claim handler training, right? Just good old fashioned recognition. And that is a front line for fraud defense. So, and I think all the tools that we've talked about here today can work their way into this conversation in all sorts of ways, because the tools are probably better at making connections than we might be. But on the front line, starting there, that's a practical solution today, which is recognize when it's likely to happen, recognize what parts of your business it's likely to happen in. And when it does happen, that's when I'm going all in on understanding, okay, who is this doctor? What are we, what exact treatment are they providing? Is that really appropriate for what happened here, and connecting the dots on, the forces in play for the accident itself. So I see Daniel's back on, so I'll maybe cut the answer there.
No, thank you. And Dan Donovan, hold your thoughts on that.
I'll hold my thoughts. I got some good ones on that, so I'd like.
All right, Daniel Peregrina, while we have you.
I'm so sorry, Brian.
No, that's okay.
It was a Murphy law. It was everything working until the moment that I was about to start.
We should have had you go first. Well, welcome back. We're so glad to have you. I'd love to hear some thoughts from your perspective at Chubb.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. And thanks for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be here sharing thoughts and learning from each other. So I think we are in a very interesting moment in the industry. I would say it's a disruptive moment. And the reason why I believe in that is because of all the new technologies that we have currently available. As you know, we have more than 1,500 insurtechs now in the world, and every day we hear about a new one that is starting a new operation. I think around 25 years ago, we went through something similar, where we started to using better systems, workflow, task management, digital documentation, etc. But now we are talking about bots, artificial intelligence, no human interaction, STP, as we heard from Eric and Dan. And Eric mentioned about buying a suit. I like to use cooking analogy as I like to cook. So I think today, like going to the grocery and buy ingredients to cook, we can go and buy solutions from insurtech or companies that are available like in the shelves, right? And using the same cooking analogy, the better and fresh ingredients are those that you can produce at home and by yourself. Because if you go and get from the shelf, you're gonna be like everybody else, right? So if you can, Eric mentioned like tailor-made, if you can do it in home, you can create some advantage against other players. I have mentioned all that because I believe today the technology is what is driven most of the changes in the industry, and also the way we are serving our clients. Especially now after the pandemic, I think we're gonna see a boost in all the digital claims experience and all digital experience, right? As we are seeing. When we talk about fraud and efficiency, and fraud is an important component that makes us lose efficiency, what everyone is looking at is how we can process claims faster, paying the right amount, and not paying fraudulent claims. This is our kind of master chef dish, right? This is the best that we could do. And based on that, I would like to mention a couple of things besides technology, or technology can impact, but in a indirectly. So first of all, when we talk about claims culture, we still see and feel resistance to the new. I think this is something that everyone that is in this moment, in this meeting, we can always stop and think about. We see resistance everywhere, right? So this is human natural behavior to keep ourselves in what we call comfort zone. And our job as leaders is to get out of this comfort zone and be open to hear something new every moment. We see in all organizations people performing tasks without understanding why and if it's really needed. And the skill to question and challenge is crucial for any change. The claims operational roles and also some technical roles will be with time replaced by bots and artificial intelligence. And if we don't prepare ourselves to add the values that a machine cannot add, we will lose space. The new values I believe we need to seek for us and for the new people we lead are the critical and strategic thinking. And one that I like to talk about is compassion. If you ask me, I see compassion more as a skill than like a feeling. It's a skill that that I will say that help us to understand better each other. And every day we are living in a most diverse world and surrounded by diversity. We are not with people, and I think we are now realizing that more of the same is not the right way. We have to have differences, and compassion is something to help us to understand difference and work with that, and also help us to understand not only behaviors from the people that work with us, but also understand behaviors from the clients. For those who know me, I always, and I keep saying that every now and then, that I think it's the time now to use the best what the machines can offer, and also use the best of the human being can offer in a claims process. We are here talking about claims service, but we cannot forget that what we need to question the most is the product we sell. I think claims, it's an area that it's always used to execute what someone else is imagining and developing, and we need to be part of the creation of that product, because there's no way to simplify process, there's no way to avoid fraud if we are not part of the product creation. And I see that in my organization and talking to people in other organizations, we are trying to digitalize analog products, right? So we need to come up with, and I think this is something that everybody's working on, but not only to have digital service, but to have digital products as well. A product that is complex will create also complex process, because we're going to have to execute whatever is written, right? So that's a good way to start. Is always looking what happened before the claim, and it's the product creation. For last, going back to the technology piece of it and the issue tags and everything available, I just want to mention a couple of things that I recently have interacted with, that I think it's that I heard about it and I read about it. We now have companies like Formotive, that they do they can evaluate the customer digital behavior, so we can know exactly how the customer are behaving in websites. We have solutions for fraud that can use big data that can link a person to another person and understand if you had not only that individual, but that who that individual is surrounded by. I mean, we have different technologies that we can use, and as a kind of as a good kind of cooker, I would say that putting the ingredients together, sometimes you're going to have to buy something because you cannot grow everything at home. So you, if you can mix what you can build at home plus using the right ingredients, that's the way to get a very good and efficient claims process.
Yes, it's great points. And well, at least on my end, it's not that far off from dinner time. So it's got me thinking about how to put everything together. Daniel, you said something that really resonated with me. I have a specialty lines background most recently. Dan and I used to work together in personal lines way back in the day. But it is that coming together of underwriting and claims. And we have a question here that I think is a really interesting one. As we think about using better data and better processes on the claim side, Daniel, I think you're spot on. That's great and it's digital, but what if the underlying product is both analog and missing the insights? You know, when you talked about these sort of the fraud rings, right? People are in different circles. Dan, Donovan, I know for Shift, that's one of the key things is spotting across carriers, across claims, what sorts of behaviors are triggering that any individual carrier might miss because they're only seeing what they're seeing and not the broader behavior and the interconnections of people. That all feels like it could be very valuable from an underwriting standpoint about how we evaluate our exposures, our lines. I'd love to get some thoughts on how we take, I know this is a claims conversation, but how we take the work we're doing here in claims on fraud, on being more efficient, and the data that's exposing about the nature of these risks, these exposures, and bring it into the underwriting side. I'd love to hear real world, from the carriers here, what you're seeing. Dan, Donovan, if I could open with you, because you guys are at the crux of where a lot of this information is coming from, are you having clients who are saying, let's pull this into our underwriting decision making as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, when you think of it, even just from a claims fraud perspective, the best fraud is the fraud that never makes its way into your book of business in the first place, right? So if you can detect it at point of sale, point of quote, through the underwriting binding process, that's the best case scenario. And it's interesting, this discussion around network detection, because that's an area that is being used very effectively by us for some of our customers around the underwriting world. And on the question from our friend from Africa, I was going to talk to that as well on the claims piece, because using data at scale and being able to create networks of entities that are connected, such as providers who might be ambulance chasing providers and maybe are in the middle of actually creating that ring of activity, is one way that we would suggest that you look to detect that fraud and attack it, right? Is by using all your data plus external data at scale, creating those, identifying those relationships and looking for patterns of fraudulent behavior in that data and those social connections. And that's something similar that we're doing for underwriting, where we're looking at things like ghost broking rings. We're looking at things like identity theft being, and policies being taken out under fake identities. And to do that, you need to have, of course, all of the application data, the quote data, the policy data, as well as external data sources. So looking at things like device IDs, IP addresses, these types of things that can generate high volumes of data, right? So you need to be able to, again, look at that at scale, make those connections between those IP addresses or those device IDs and who is attached to them, who is using them. Is it one person all the time? Is it one person? It's that device ID, but they've taken out 100 policies. And every one of those policies, is a certain, they come from a certain business, or they come from a certain geography, right? And what are those patterns that you start to see in that large scale data through those connections? So that's one area that we're having an impact already for some of our customers, is looking at that at their book that way, and then looking in real time at these applications and these quotes as they're coming in, and appending this information to the existing networks that were created off their historical data, right? So you can say, this application that just came in appears to be tied to a network that we had already identified that looked suspicious in the past, block that.
Yeah.
That's just one example, but yeah, it's just as applicable in the underwriting and sales space as it is in the P&C side.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a good excuse for claims and underwriting to come together more, which
Absolutely.
is generally a positive thing. Eric Sanders, that for me, it hits on one of your initial points about partnering across the rest of the business and, getting in on the business plan, thinking about it holistically. Are you guys seeing the same thing where claims can feed back into underwriting for better decision-making and design up front?
100%. And it's probably why I put that in the remarks, because it's a passion. And it plays so well in this space as any other space. Certainly the tools that we're exploring here to get better at fraud detection and fighting are the same tools that can help us gather data, right? And sort of look at it in ways that will be helpful to underwriting. It manifests all over the place. If you just think about real fundamentally, loss control, right? Loss control is out there pre-loss. And so we know, if we know the scenarios that are going to play out, we can kind of advise the insured's policyholders on the front end and help them to prevent it. Like you said, the best loss is the one that never happens. Couldn't agree more. The tools come into play all over the place and have a lot of applicability in a broad way that I think that we can all take advantage of through the data and analytics. There's the premium audits, right, of the world. There's just some carriers have different scale than others. So I'm not sure, by fighting fraud, we're going to move the needle this much on a loss ratio, for example. But the scenarios that are prevalent are ones that are really well worth knowing, and inflationary trends that kind of go alongside of that based on attitudes. We're seeing it in social inflation. You're having to address it at a high level in an organization relative to how you're thinking about what's going to happen next on an inflation trend. And if you were previously not building social inflation into that equation or fraud inflation, you're probably going to be a little behind the eight ball. So there's all sorts of spots, I think, where it is an excuse for us to get together. And this, hasn't always been a natural marriage between underwriting and claims. So sometimes I will say from our perspective, we've kind of had to, find our seat at the table and force our way in and make sure that conversation absolutely happens, because we don't want to be 2 years down the road and not had it. And next thing you know, it's coming out in the results, and we had an opportunity to speak up. So it's a big topic around our place for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it is very true. It's going to come out one way or the other. So you can't hide the losses. Once they're there, they're there. So you might as well bring that into the decision-making up front. Daniel Peregrina, you sparked the question. So I'm assuming the answer is yes, you're doing these things at Chubb, but I'd love to hear some more about it.
Yeah, at Chubb, we are trying to move exactly what I said, to have more digital products. And this is something that it came from claims, it came from us. When we try to accomplish, sorry, can you hear me? I
Yes.
just lost for a second. So when we try to accomplish the STP that Eric mentioned before, we realized that doing STP with products that we already have, it will be very complicated. So at the same time we are working STP for those products, we decided to create simple products, more digital products that can help also to have a better risk, and also that help us to have an easier process and to apply all the rules that is necessary.
That's I think that's such a nice way to reinforce the point you're making before about the digital versus the analog products. And you can straight through processify, if that's a term, the old products, but you're probably better off building something new from a product standpoint anyway, and probably less time and pain. We have a number of really good questions in here, and it's a tricky thing to pick. There's one about KPIs in fraud and fraud detection and prevention, and I want to take that and just broaden it a bit so that we hit on the other side of this equation. How do we vet the fraud KPIs in light of the efficiency goals? And especially as we think about straight through processing, which should really include fraud in that straight through process, or it ends up not being straight through because now we're running a side organization on the fraud side, maybe too late because we've moved the claim so quickly. What sort of KPIs do we think about to handle the fraud and be efficient and not have one run away from the other? Dan, you've seen this across multiple organizations, so I'd love your perspective to open up.
Yeah, thanks. So typically, we're looking in things in terms of total percentage of all claims received that are being flagged as potentially suspicious, right? And then the next level would be, of those, which are those of those are accepted for investigation, then what's the outcome on those? That's pretty standard type of fraud stuff. And some carriers track it, others don't. Mitigated value, so where their dollars saved through the investigation potentially, right? But when you start to bring this into the claims environment, the claims space, where you've got your fraud detection underlying your claims automation or supporting the claims process, how do you start to look at things there? And we try to broaden it out and start to look at things more in terms of leakage and efficiency gains now, right, as well. So by having automated fraud detection, does it allow you to screen a claim faster than your manual process did, take action on that claim and move it toward resolution because you have a higher degree of confidence that it's free of fraud? And you've also not only been able to look for potential fraud, but now probably also automate some of the tasks related to the handling of the claim, so you become more efficient. And by doing that and settling claims faster, are you settling them at a better value? And are you, starting to reduce leakage from the standpoint, not just of identifying suspicious claims and keeping them out, but reducing the adjustment cost of a claim because you're able to be, a lot faster in resolving those things. So those are just a couple of small examples of it, but we try to start to look at it more broadly and start to look at things from not just a pure detection of fraud standpoint, but efficiency gains, creating more effectiveness, reducing cycle times, and reducing overall leakage, right? Get that total combined ratio down by attacking all those different points.
Yeah, and not taking any one component in a vacuum.
That's right.
Eric, does that mirror how you would look at it at QBE?
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I was taking notes. I'm like, oh yeah, those are the ones we're looking at. So all good, right? Those are good. Where I would start a conversation there is, one, it comes down to execution. So it's nice to track things, but I would say kind of putting the discipline in place around how you manage to it is probably equally as important. And that's not to kind of put a hammer on people. It's just, you achieve what you measure. And so we need to be transparent is probably the word I would use there, that becomes really important. And I said it early on in my comments, kind of sharing the information broadly around the organization, because we're all fighting for dollars, right? So like understanding the problem, understanding how effective we are in fighting the problem, understanding how it has the effects that Dan just said, cycle times, and there are other downstream implications, I think, that are really important that play into kind of the cost benefit that folks are thinking about when you're placing those dollars. And then, we found certainly that the connection between anyone who's working in your SIU group and your claims technical team is really important. And I've seen over my career places where it works pretty good, and I've seen places where it doesn't. We've got a particularly good setup now, all, credit to Brian Wilson, who runs our SIU group, for kind of making sure that we bring that together and we're collaborating, and the metrics just sort of fall into place, right? You got to look at them across all the aspects that Dan said and make sure you're transparent and then executing against it.
Yeah. Daniel, I have a feeling this may be the final comment, so no pressure on having the final word, but
no
love
problem.
to hear your thoughts.
I think, yeah, something that I think we should consider is that the decisions that we make are as good as the information that we have, right? So if we don't have good information, we cannot make good decisions. And for fraud and efficiency is the same thing. If we track very closely all the fraud cases, as Dan mentioned, you're going to bother less customers. You're not going to bother the customers that you should not bother. And for efficiency, the same thing. You need to track and measure to understand where you can be better. So if like a race driver, right? If you don't know your time, you don't know how to improve that. So information is crucial to make good decisions.
That was efficient. That's good. We did have some other questions, but I think if we try to answer any of them, it's going to end up putting us well over the time. What I will say is there's one here about the accuracy of the automation of fraud detectors for insurance purposes. How reliable and accurate are they? And I think the answer is it depends. It depends what you use and how you use it. And are you using a great model you built right here, right now, but it has no way to learn and to grow and to see across things? Well, then it's going to be very accurate today, but not long term. Or if you build something that will learn and expand and using external data sources to see things you could never see. I mean, that's really critical, and not just for fraud, really for any of the tools that we're starting to use on the underwriting side, the processing side, et cetera. I do want to just bring one summary point back for this whole group. It's interesting. We're talking about fraud and automation and AI and big data and all these sorts of, computer heavy terms on that side. And we're talking about straight through processing. And again, automation, digitization, efficiency is all very tech heavy. But each and every one of you, including the guy who's from a solution that is doing all that, advanced AI-based ML kind of buzzword, advanced solutions, you're all talking about the human aspect of it. You're all talking about communication, collaboration. Dan Donovan used the term augmented and not replacing. Right. So we're talking about the coming together, whether it's claims and underwriting, people and solutions, communicating, working with our customers. Daniel, you talked about these ingredients that we're all putting together and being a chef. That's a different tone than maybe people would think. And I think it's a great reminder of the human nature. Going back to Daniel's word, compassion. That is what this job is ultimately about, right? We are seeing people at the worst moments they go through. So thinking about how we use these tools to serve them better, to reduce fraud so that the people who deserve to get paid are getting paid the way they should. And it's all happening efficiently without opening the door for more problems is critical. I'm really thankful to this panel today. Daniel, fighting through some technology hurdles, but you stuck with us to bring some great points. Eric, fantastic insights from your experience at QBE, really thinking across the gamut from inception through to the kinds of things you're seeing in the real world, some of the tools you're using, the KPIs that you're depending on. And Dan, great perspective from Shift across a number of carriers and your experience there, and how we can solve these things and deal with not just increasing fraud, the need to be more efficient, an aging population of people in the roles, and making the work interesting for those who are still there today. Fantastic conversation, great questions from the audience. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.